We're here today in the heart of the tar sands, the new frontier of climate destruction, to shut down this large oil sands mining project. We're taking this action to stop a global climate crime and to push President Obama and Prime Minister Harper to say no to the tar sands, because real climate leaders don't buy tar sands. The tar sands are the largest industrial project on the face of the planet. By 2020, they'll emit more emissions than the entire Czech Republic, twice as much as Peru, and over 10 times that of Costa Rica. When we're in a global climate crisis, when over 300,000 people will die this year because of climate change, 1 million more will become climate refugees, a project like this simply can't go on. Tar sands are the poster child for climate destruction. They're set to displace an area larger than England. This is a toxic industry, and the only future that it's going to lead us to is a toxic one for the next generation. It's time that President Obama and Prime Minister Harper stand up and be true leaders. What we need now is more real climate leaders. We want them to say no to the tar sands and yes to a green energy future.
All right. So as you see, we're going to be talking about the tar sands in Canada. A lot of folks are thinking that's a bad idea. That was a little action by Greenpeace. I don't know when that was. Probably fairly recently. A lot of other organizations, the Northern Rockies Rising Tide, the Indigenous Environmental Network, and a lot of others are starting to weigh in against this. A lot of indigenous tribes. It's incredible how much people are organizing this. And also there's a group, National Wildlife Federation, and we have Michael O'Leary with that organization who's going to talk a little bit about this. And I've taken as that I have taken some of these videos off the screen, so they're not the best in the world, but they get the idea across of what's going on. And we have three more. One is a trailer for a documentary that's going to be here in town, I think, the first week of February, called Dirty Oil, I believe. But we'll just get right into it. Welcome to the program, Michael.
Thanks. Good to see you.
All right. Where would you start with all this? I mean, I think this tar sands is something I've been wanting to talk about for some time. Nobody seems to know much about it. But it's an area the size of England?
Yeah, or Florida is another, a frame of reference for some folks. It is an enormous area. I'd say two things about the tar sands right away. One, it is, by its design, an intentional disaster. What they're doing up there is just absolutely the worst kind of strip mining you could ever have asked for. First, they find an area of pristine forest land, kind of like the area, let's say, between Sisters and Bend, where, you got some pines and some rolling hills and some, beautiful features. They clear cut that. Then they start to dig in with big excavators. And then if they don't find the oil base that they're looking for, then they inject it with solvents and high-pressure water that they take out of the river nearby and make a huge slurry mess out of it. Then, of course, it has to go to a refinery, because what at best that they find there is basically stuff that kind of looks like either oily sand or even more like a peat bog or a kind of a mess that they have to really turn down into basically what the next level is, something that looks like peanut butter. And that won't flow in a pipeline yet, so they got to work some more. So then that gets into our next problem. All that energy that it takes to turn, not oil out of a ground, out of a hole, but basically the most distant connection of carbon to oil is a global warming concern. Absolutely. It's about 2 or 3 times the intensity of global warming impacts on that extraction and refinery to get that oil out of the ground. Then, of course, they pipe it on over here and keep our dependence on oil going instead of turning our attention to, ethanol blends or electric cars or, getting people out of their cars and onto transit and onto bikes. So it's a fascinating intentional disaster that's threatening birds, wildlife, the land, the people that rely on the water, Native American, indigenous Canadian communities up there that are
First Nations.
First Nations
Yeah.
is probably the better word. Thank you. That the folks that are up there that are finding increased rates of cancer and other
in the
and
areas
asthma.
around
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
because of the water.
Yeah, and of course they're losing their tribal hunting grounds as well because it's removing so much of the native forest land up there.
Well, I don't know where to go to from there. I kind of pictured tar sands when I first heard about it as peat bogs or something.
Yep.
So, but it's not just a bunch of a wasteland.
No, in the 90s, the oil company started calling it tar sands, and that's actually one of the things that I've been working with myself to how do we cognitively talk about this in a way that people recognize, because it's such a tangential issue right now for most people. At best, they've maybe heard of tar sands, but most folks haven't. But then when you really talk about tar sands, you're really talking about some sort of soil concept that petroleum engineers have designed to sort of sanitize this process, make you think like it's a wasteland. It's not a wasteland. It is when they are done with it, but it wasn't when they started.
And a couple other things. It is probably just recently that oil has gotten up a high enough worth that it has made this economically feasible.
Well, I've heard disputes on what the exact price point is, but I think we're well over that price point. The other dynamic is a national security dynamic, where folks are trying to figure out how to, keep our concern for oil working in here in North America as opposed to having to go to overseas for it. And that's another sort of driver for this. Senator Jeff Merkley, for his point, has been talking about energy independence from oil and saying that as long as we're, crutching ourselves along with Canadian oil, we're not really independent. We're not really moving forward. It's a distraction. Beautiful report he did back mid-year on this one. Really excited about the leadership he's shown on this issue.
Right. Well, another thing I was thinking as well is the fact that it is now a barrel of oil is worth so much money that they can do this economically feasible. They are able to bring this oil in and then keep the price down. So what are they paying in Europe? $7, $8, $9 a gallon. We're paying $3 here. And if they keep finding these, especially finding them so close, it keeps the price down to where folks won't. Of course, there's the move towards electric cars and hybrids, but it's just a pittance of what needs to be done.
Right.
And I think this probably works in that direction.
It does. It serves to keep us moving along in that direction. And it's no surprise to me that, when you look at all the companies that are up there, it's no longer just one or two Canadian boutique national firms. Everybody's in now.
It started out that way, but what is it, Conoco I saw, and so what are some of the other ones that are involved?
BP, Shell, you name them, they're there. Exxon, it's you can't look at the logos without seeing everybody that you pass on the street every day.
The same one that brought you the Deep Horizon and brought you the Nigerian, the Delta in Niger, and all these different places are the players up there, and. You say the National Wildlife Federation is just hooked into this?
Well, we're one of the first environmental organizations to go from a national perspective of concern on this to actually try and localize the campaign. And that's a fascinating concept for us because if you look at what the Sierra Club or NRDC or other folks have done on this, it's typically been a look over there, it's bad, and vote against it or tell your senator to vote against it. And that kind of level of action is what we most often think of things in terms of that get us involved. Except when you think of things like, well, the Ban the Bag campaign. We're getting our grocery bags are going to be, canvas or, reusable. It's wonderful. And if you think about things like the LNG campaigns that we've had here, it's in our backyard now. And trying to figure out how we localize energy campaigns is a fascinating new part. And of course, we have to globalize our concerns as well. But the reality is, consumers of gasoline don't even have the knowledge they need to make the choice that they want to make right now. True story is, in Oregon, about 80 to 90% of our gasoline is tar-free still. We're not a major importer of it yet. They're proposing to expand a Canadian pipeline out to BC to bring it around to our refining in Anacortes, to bring it down the Lowell pipeline from Seattle down to Portland, where we'll then pick it up at our pumps here. They're proposing to do that over the next 5 years, and that would be a tremendous change. If we can resist that, that would be fantastic. And of course, what we really like to have is consumers every day, when they go to the pump, not just be able to look at the price, not just be able to look at the octane rating or know whether you're buying plus or regular, but to actually look at the global warming footprint of that gallon of gas. wouldn't it be nice to have a little carbon footprint rating right there next to the tag?
Like the protein and the fat and the trans fats in
Buyer
your food
beware,
or something. Yeah,
right? Know what you're going to do. And I think that would be great if we had folks that were bringing, easier impact oil. And I don't want to, greenwash regular oil here, but we are now talking about dirty oil, not just as a redundant term to mean dirty oil, but to talk about a superlative, meaning like there's oil, and then there's really dirty oil. And if we've got folks that are being, major importers of that stuff, well, those folks should pay the price with their customers, and they should be real honest about what they're bringing into this area and see how much Portland and the state of Oregon wants to buy that stuff. I don't think if an Oregonian had a choice, they'd choose, dirty oil. I don't think they would.
They'd have to know what it is.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
And that, that's I was leading up when I asked you about the National Wildlife Federation. If they've been on this for a while. You've been on long enough to know, I'm sure you check to see what the corporate media talks about this. Do they talk about it?
Well, by corporate media, that's a really, good perspective to keep on this. What we get filtered to us is not always the easiest stuff to get. And what I've been doing in my research is trying to go as deep as possible into the reports the Canadian government's putting out, reports that local Canadian environmental firms are putting out, and finding out what's going on in Idaho and Montana, local grassroots citizen campaigns that are going on there, because they're concerned about the big loads of refining equipment that's going to, destroy their beautiful, countryside roads. Finding that stuff firsthand is really the best way to go. So my number one thing to say is if you want to research something, Google it. Keep going.
Keep going.
But the New York Times is doing some brand new coverage on this. They've been actually keyed in and interested on it. The Spokesman Review in the Intermountain area has been really following this stuff closely. I would also say the Oregonian just did a recent piece on this. I found some things in there that I thought were, in some cases, thorough, in some cases not a balance that I thought, made sense from my perspective. For example, they found a number of local companies that, were a part of the mining supply chain, but they didn't find a lot of local companies that were a part of the alternative fuels market that we're generating here in Portland, keeping jobs local. And I thought that was kind of an obvious miss on their part. So it's one of those things where, right now the media is largely quiet, except for very small local media and also very distant local media. And I would say, and we're going to hope that that changes.
And you mentioned heavy load, and we'll get into more of that later. But you also mentioned local companies. There's I guess they don't produce the equipment of the magnitude and the size that they need in Canada. So it's being brought in from South Korea and then brought through Western ports, northwestern ports.
Well, unfortunately, they do make refining equipment in Canada and all parts of North America. What the folks up there decided to do was to outsource the jobs to the cheapest possible location that they could find, which to them added up to be, of all places, South Korea. So, somewhere in South Korea, some folks are making, let's just say, not U.S. steelworker union wages and not Canadian assembly worker wages up there either. Let's say there's some folks in South Korea that have got a job, and they're building what ends up being a prefabrication of plants, and they make sure that they, either pre-assemble them only in parts, or then they actually cut the welds open and put it into quarters or halves or whatever they do. They put it into cargo ships. They offload the cargo ships at the Port of Vancouver, set it onto a pad. Then it goes onto a barge. Barge go up the locks. When they get to Lewiston, Idaho, they come off the locks, and they go onto these huge trailers, the size of things that you'd put the Spruce Goose on or a space shuttle on. They're 24 feet wide. They're 30 feet tall. They're 500,000 pounds, about somewhere between 5 to 10 times the average weight of a regular tractor trailer. They've got engines in the front and the back.
5 times bigger than a logging truck or something.
Yeah,
loaded.
You look at that stuff and you realize there's not a lot of roads that will go on. It's an interstate or a very large country road. Yeah.
Well, there's another little video. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long, and it goes over some of the information, but we just talked about. But it also makes it very visual.
Yeah.
So we'll move into that and
Great.
see when we come back. We'll continue.
It's over one of the largest recoverable oil patches in the world, second only to Saudi Arabia, covering 149,000 square kilometers. An area larger than England. It holds at least 175 billion barrels of crude bitumen found beneath boreal forest, muskeg, and rivers. To access the sandy tar-like substance, the land referred to by the industry as overburden is removed and saved for future reclamations. Cranes and 400-ton trucks haul the bitumen off to extraction plants where, in order to separate the sand from the bitumen, it is mixed with large amounts of fresh water heated by natural gas. It is then spun with a chemical solvent to further remove clay and minerals, leaving the remaining wastewater to be dumped into enormous toxic tailings ponds. The siphoned-off bitumen is then sent into pipelines to be processed into crude oil throughout North America. Has our need for oil become greater than our need for water? Fresh water has already become a scarce resource. We think of it as being infinite, but of the world's total water supply, only half of 1% is accessible fresh water. The oil sands mining operations use up to 4 barrels of fresh water to produce 1 barrel of oil. This water comes from the Athabasca River system, which is fed from glaciers at the base of the Rocky Mountains. Not only does the industry suck up large quantities of fresh water, but it will soon produce more carbon emissions than all of Canada's passenger cars combined. The oil produced by industry contributes to a cycle of consumption that accelerates climate change, further destroying the very glaciers that feed this delicate cycle. Oil sands production is developing at breakneck speed. This pace is driven by corporate interests aimed at integrating North America's economies and resources. The North American Free Trade Agreement's proportionality clause ensures that an average percentage of energy resources continue to flow south. This guarantees an increasing export of a finite resource. The oil sands are quickly becoming the largest industrialized project in human history. With a proposed 5-fold increase in production, oil sands networks will soon span the continent. A new agreement called the Security and Prosperity Partnership further expands NAFTA, ensuring energy security for the United States, but not for Canada. Canada remains one of the only industrialized countries that has not saved any energy for itself. These resource agreements can also apply to water.
All right, well, that picture that just came up there at the end is something we're going to talk about in a little while. We've got four pictures that we're going to be discussing as we go on. That made it visual. I mean, they did a good job on that with the hummingbirds and the oil and all that. You know, we've covered how large this area is, and it's not that large now. That's a potential area. Or is that how large it is now? As large as England?
It's enormous now, yeah.
And it's going to keep getting larger.
It's basically, I think there's somewhere between 60 to 70% of the world's remaining oil reserves are found there. That is just an amazing concept in terms of the actual geography we're talking about.
And as Winona LaDuke said, it's basically trying to get oil out of dirt.
It is.
You know, I mean, it's like squeezing oil out of dirt.
And unfortunately, it's not just dirt sitting there fallow. It's dirt underneath the forest. It's dirt around indigenous communities. It's dirt that is a part of the soils, that is a part of the riparian area, that's a part of a river system, that's a part of a downstream community's livelihood. It's an amazing thing. Again, as we talk about this, are we talking about just about tar sands? Are we talking about, you know, what used to be, you know, Canadian wilderness that's turned into an intentional sacrifice zone? It's like, you know, the BP oil spill put up on top, and they're doing it on purpose. It's just an amazing thing to really conceptualize.
And if folks want to stop to think about it, you know, the indigenous people. You know, we were all indigenous people at one time. Whether you're talking about indigenous people that are being pushed aside in the Amazon in order to plant soybeans, or indigenous people that are now suffering however times the national average of birth defects because of the uranium mining in the four corners of this country that is now considered a sacrifice zone. The same thing up here, the sacrifice zone, what Hanford did to the local indigenous communities. You know, when are we all going to have enough of this? And it's also that we can drive our cars. And I drive a car. I'm sure Michael drives a car. But there are ways that we can try to mitigate this. And I think that maybe stopping the deep oil drilling was a good move. There's other ways to do that. Figure out ways to do the electric cars and all that. But this is a really good way, is just not to get started doing this. Like with the LNG, not to get started doing it.
Yeah, and you know, when you start looking at, you know, the Merkley report again on you know, independence from oil, it's not just one thing. You know, it's the same thing that you have with the energy grid. It's not just going to be one thing. We're not just going to turn the world into a Jetsons solar world. You know, everybody's got to do their part. You know, part of it's conservation, part of it's, you know, bridge fuel, and part of it's, you know, moving over and making some smart choices. You know, when you think about how long cars idle in bad traffic, or how long cars idle at drive-ups, you know, that's just a waste. And we've got to figure out how we minimize that waste. But when we look at you know, other problems that we're doing, we're wasting trips. And that's something that you can figure out. You know, how many times you go back and forth across town because you're like, oh, I forgot something, or I got 3 or 4 things to do today. I could punch them in and do it and make it 5 things tomorrow and save myself 2 in the net. Well, people just got to get a little more conscientious about that. I don't think we can save the, you know, our entire planet with lifestyle environmentalism. At a certain point, we've got to get electric cars that are available. We've got to have a grid that works for them. We've got to have batteries that last a long time. We need the federal government to help us out with that. We need the state government to help us out with that. I can't make an industry, you know, appear overnight that's going to be the new technologies. But we need new technologies, right? And we need to support that. We need to do that more than tax cuts for the rich, so that the guy who owns that yacht can pass it down to his kids. I was watching the Bernie Sanders speech the other day. Boy, that is just frustrating.
He nailed it. You know, what you're talking about is everything we need to do is important, but it seems to me the underlying thing is awareness and presence of mind.
Yeah, yeah, and following through. You know, as you point out, I probably drive a car. I do drive a car. I ride a bike quite a bit, but you know, it's one of those things where, you know, I'm not here to try and say by driving a car you're the enemy, but you know, I am trying to say if you're not thinking about it, well, you got room for improvement. You know, minimize, get smart. You know, if carpool works for you, that's great. If TriMet works for you, that's great. If walking's good for your heart, and you're trying to figure out how to lose a little bit of weight, maybe pick one day a week to do that. You know, there's some good things about that. Portland's an easy community to do that. Right,
and it's in some ways it's on the cutting edge. You know, along with like Austin, Texas, and you know, I think Missoula, Montana, where we've had a director here on our program many times, Frank Mahoney, who's now living in Missoula, and he's the one that kind of put the bug in my bonnet most recently about this issue. And there's a lot of activity there, and you'd think that, well, it's going to be, you know, maybe not jobs in Missoula, but there's jobs going to be generated by this. And as you say, this heavy haul is going to be going. We're going to hear from Naomi Klein in a little bit about that. But a lot of these folks are against this that you think might be for it.
Well, you know, the things that happen when it's in your own backyard is, you know, people pay attention, people start to speak up. And what's happened is along this route, Highway 12 from Lewiston, Idaho, up all the way through the Panhandle and into, you know, inner Montana there and on up to Canada, that route that they're talking about is not a route that's meant for anything other than some fishermen, a couple of emergency trucks, some tourists taking a long way to get to Yellowstone, and some bicycle riders who are trying to ride across, you know, from east to west and on the northern route. It is not a heavy highway, and they're trying to repurpose that into what will essentially be one of the most impacted transportation corridors you could ever imagine. They've got over 240 of these heavy haul trips on the books, and these are lumbering loads, again, of 500,000 pounds, moving no faster than 5 miles an hour, that will be taking more than a couple of days to make this route, pulling over in turnouts, blocking people from using those turnouts with 5 cop cars in front and 5 cop cars in back to try and block traffic. I don't know if you've ever been in that area. Have you taken that route?
No, I've been wanting to see that area for some time.
I did it once as a kid. It's a beautiful place, and I'll tell you, it is the place where, you know, a river runs through it. I mean, that book, that movie is about that area.
Oh, okay.
It's one of those, you know, it is some of the most scenic places you could ever imagine. And the disruption to people's very tranquil, very intentionally created lifestyles up there is viscerally felt by the people who are not just going to have a small traffic delay, but are going to have a whole lifestyle subgrade happen to them. And frankly, I think that the concerns that we have about accidents are in no way out of order. What we found already just in a small amount of research is just even a regular semi-tractor trailer rig fell into the river there just this summer. And earlier in the year, we found one of the huge heavy loads that they've tried to take up an alternate route through Montana actually also had a wreck. So that we've had folks from the highway departments and from the sponsoring corporations suggest to us, oh, it's a 1 in a million shot. These things we don't have wrecks. We're safety first, and we already know that they do on that road, and they do with those heavy loads when they take them other places. It's like, it's amazing. The permit process has been fascinating to follow. Apparently, the corporations and the Department of Transportation have been coordinating on this for up to 2 years, with no public hearings prior to the lawsuits being filed.
That's what I was going to ask next. You were talking about the local people aren't going to like this, but you mentioned cops are going to be escorting this, so there's going to be a component of government agencies involved in this. And you say they're jumping on board, or it's a mixed reaction, or?
I would say the governors of Idaho and Montana appear to be supportive of this. And their departments of transportation, their state police officers, their planners, have been doing engineering work to make this happen. And that's not to say that there hasn't been local governments or other people within those agencies or with jobs working for those governors who haven't had second thoughts, alternate opinions, and have, in some cases gone out of their way to share those opinions and share some interesting information with the public. So we're really appreciative of the folks who've spoken up and helped out.
I know we have some graphics of the Northern Rockies Rising Tide Group and the Indigenous Environmental Network. Might be a good time to put up some of those. The Northern Rockies Rising Tide organization is a really good website that I don't know if you go to that. If you go to Rising Tide, is it Northern Rockies Rising Tide, .wordpress.com or something like that, that'll take you right to a blog on this issue. And they are, what I've been hearing from Frank is mostly about the heavy haul. So is that what's going on mostly in Idaho and Montana, is the heavy haul, or are they also being told about what's going on with the actual tar sands?
Well, I think there's a couple different layers there that you're speaking of, and it certainly isn't my depth, as I haven't been into those communities. All I know is what's been filtered to me through my research and internet and conversation, so I won't pretend to speak for those folks at all. But what I'll also point out, one of our partners, All Against the Haul, which does have local sponsorship with Trish Weber down in Corvallis, is one of the original founders of that group, originally from Montana herself. Folks like that have been involved and have been getting organized about this. AllAgainstTheHaul.org has got a beautiful website. Is that up there? Yeah. It's gorgeous. Lots of good current photography. Lots of good rich background. If you tab on some of the information for press kits and stuff, and it's footnoted and it's downloadable and it's gorgeous.
Right.
I mean, I started pulling the excuse me, the statements from the Nez Perce tribe. I was like, wow, I hadn't seen this before. This isn't coming up in the corporate media press, but it's there to be found for the the folks that are digging it up on site and doing it.
I'm glad you brought that along, because what I've ran across is the Northern Rockies Rising Tide and the Indigenous Environmental Network, and it's good to have another one that's focused on that. But we talked quite a bit about this heavy haul. There's another one that's put out. I don't know if it's put out by the Indigenous Environmental Network, although it starts out with a page from them, and then it's got a lot of written words. And then Naomi Klein, who folks probably are familiar with, she's been in town here a few times. Wrote the book The Shock Doctrine. She's a Canadian citizen, very savvy woman, and very, very articulate. And she speaks about this issue a little bit from her perspective, and then we'll come back.
are your first impressions of the trip down Highway 12 where the proposed mega haul Imperial Oil truck route is supposed to go?
Well, the thing you can't understand unless you actually go the route that these massive, massive trucks with their huge loads are going to go, the thing you can't understand is just how vulnerable this ecosystem is. I mean, this is some of the most beautiful country I've ever seen in my life, and I'm Canadian, so I've seen some pretty beautiful wilderness, but this is really amazing, and the roads are so narrow because they built it to have the minimal impact on this incredible natural environment. So they're very narrow, they're windy roads, they're very close to rivers and creeks, and it's kind of an abomination to imagine these hauls that are utterly out of scale with nature, with humanity, in this natural environment. And what I felt was embarrassed as a Canadian, and really that this was one more way in which the tar sands are putting our natural world at incredible risk, and it has to be stopped.
I think that's
So obviously what they're trying to do there in Montana and Lewis and Idaho area and that whole area is to approach the folks and make them think this is a good deal. But this is just opening the door. There's going to be pipelines as well.
Yeah.
From what you were saying.
Well, there is
once they get the stuff, the oil, whatever they do with it, they're going to have to bring it down here.
Right. It's in and out is what we're seeing in terms of transportation. They've exported some jobs to South Korea. They're importing some equipment on up the road. And, of course, they're going to be exporting the oil back down to us. Right now, the biggest expansion that they're talking about is of an existing pipeline network that's significantly going to be impacting all the way across the Midwest, is the Keystone XL pipeline expansion is what they call that. And importantly, as it goes over Nebraska, it touches, I think, the nation's largest freshwater aquifer. And to have any one of these, accidents that will never happen there is a disaster we can't afford, of course. Mm-hmm. And again, it just, and right now they're expanding a pipeline that is not even at capacity yet. So it's fascinating to think about, the kind of ideas they've got for ramping this stuff up. There's another Enbridge pipeline that's going across through BC, which would then change our West Coast relatively clean, again, not to greenwash it, but relatively clean, oil sourcing with more of this dirty tar oil coming over from Alberta, through British Columbia, and then popping it down our back door at the refinery plants in Anacortes, and that makes its way actually, then directly to our pumps here in Portland. Mm-hmm. It's just fascinating when you think about these refinery networks. If you try and, look at this stuff, there's not a lot of good information on it that's, oriented towards the consumer or the activist. Some of the stuff that we've found now, most recently, through the Department of Environmental Quality, is actually looking at this as a part of their need to move to a low carbon fuel standard to try and figure out how we, are upgrading our, fuels that we're using to be the best possible mix that we possibly can. And they're doing this, of course, at a time as, in the back door, the petroleum companies are, making our fuel with a greater global warming impact. So they've got a lot of work to do cut ahead.
Mm-hmm. Now, what you're just talking about, isn't that kind of related to these pictures that we have?
Yes. In fact, if we want to roll a few of these now, we can talk about
get that first one up there, and you can just kind of talk over the top of them.
Sure. Let's see what we've got. How about we hit that one last? Or we can hit that one first. But I think I had them ordered. Is there a 1, 2, 3, 4? Is that in any way possible? How about a map? No, just roll what you got. I'll talk to them in any order you want.
It takes them a second to get one out and one back in.
Hey, it's a map.
There we go.
Awesome. So this is now
good.
You're starting to see some distribution pipelines, and one of the things that's really good to know is that basically 90% of Oregon's petroleum is coming through Washington, not from Washington. They don't grow the oil there, but that's where it sits and refines, and then it makes its way either into some small tankers that come through the Columbia or also extensive pipelines from Seattle down. And about 10% makes its way originally from Utah, and that's something I had no idea until I started this, but that's part of the flow.
Refined fuels, does that mean oil or
that's
natural
meaning
gas?
gasoline. Yeah. And
Actual gasoline?
Yeah.
So I had no idea. I mean, there are actually pipelines crossing our states that have just gasoline in them.
Uh-huh.
I didn't know that. I always thought it was just tankers.
Well, we've got refining, that happened, right on the waterfront here in Portland as well. But one of the things that you'll find when you start looking into this stuff too is that part of the fuel pipeline exists to provide safe fuels to the airports and Department of Defense locations. There's an enormously rich and thick roadmap out there underneath the ground. And I'm learning stuff every day.
Mm-hmm. We might bring up another picture.
Yeah, let's give us another one.
Take potluck here and see what's next. Yeah, that is because we've got gasoline, we've got liquefied natural gas, we've got a lot of these different things going on.
Well, so this is getting into the difference where. How do I talk about it? So diesel is on the right, gasoline's on the left. You got a couple of different grids there, and so the first two are the Washington-sourced gasolines. The second two on the left are the Utah-sourced gasolines, and the difference there is they note in the numbers on top, 90 versus 102, or 91 versus 103. That's the difference between non-tar oil sourced gas and tar oil sourced gas. And so as you look at this, and it's sorry, I can't quite read what the scale of that is, unfortunately, and I'm not a chemist, so I'm not going to guess at that. But you're looking at on net there somewhere around give or take about 10% or so is what the DEQ is calculating for the overall global warming change. So as their new goal for the low carbon fuel standard is to decrease the global warming footprint of our gasoline or automobile use, that they're talking about decreasing it by 10% in 10 years. Well, this is, as we switch to this gasoline, it's going to eat that right out the tailpipe. It's going to take it. We're going to have no ability to make that goal based on this increase of 10% that's happening right now to the fuels.
And that increase of 10% is because of the tar
sourced oil. And so again, if you so to follow that math, what happens is the extraction and refining is about 2 to 3 times more global warming gas intensive, but that's only a fraction of the overall global warming impact of your car. Most of the global warming impact of your car happens on emission. Mm-hmm. So if it's 2 to 3 times on a small portion, it only ends up to being about 10% difference net overall, and that's the global warming impact that the average driver will see if you took from 100% tar-free oil to 100% tar-sourced oil.
And so that figure comes from the actual having to go in after it and whatever, distill it or whatever.
Right.
It isn't the gas that's coming from the oil or the gas that's coming from is any higher in carbon. It's how they go after it.
Exactly. There's this one here, this one's not as good for us right now. There's another slide that has got.
There's only one left. So.
Yeah, exactly. There's only one left. We looked at it earlier. I think maybe at the very start of the show.
We're putting the graphics person through their paces tonight.
Excellent.
There we go.
So this is the life cycle analysis. This is what I'm talking about. So right there, they've got an old school style well, you know, with that, you know, hammerhead that, you know, sucks it
You
up.
see those in Texas all the time.
Right, and then to the refinery, and then to the storage, and then to the pump, and then to your car. And so that part on the left there, represented by this old school oil derrick, is what we're talking about being so different, where they first clear cut a forest, then they, you know, dig up the ground, then they inject it with steam, then they turn it into oil tar, and then they have to distill it again. That's the extra process that we're talking about here, that's not only so destructive for that area, of course, beautiful Canada, but that's also very destructive for the planet. And right now, Canada is not on track to meet their Kyoto standards.
Well, it's the same thing with liquefied natural gas. They say it's so good, but actually what they do overseas in order to liquefy it brings it right up to, you know, and having to ship it over here raises the carbon footprint of it.
Yeah.
So it's really not a bridge fuel.
Yeah.
So, you know, but these issues, these portions or components of the issues are not talked about much. They certainly aren't talked about by the folks that are trying to sell it to us.
Well, no.
You have to dig around a little bit. And it's folks like you that come on and talk about this that provide the education for people.
Well, the consumer needs the right to know, and we think it should happen at the pump where the choice is made. We think labeling, truth in labeling, is a good thing. It's good for cigarettes. It's good for vegetable soup. It's good for the organic label. It's good to know whether it's 89 octane or 102. And frankly, I don't think there's a whole lot of people in Oregon that are buying their gas based on that distinction right now. But that's okay for our government to get involved in that level. We'd like to see them go just one step further and help the consumer know, you know, how much of an impact is that gasoline they're picking it from. And if they want to go to a different place, if they want to go to Exxon that's getting their oil from Alaska, or if they want to go for somewhere else, well, then it can now be an economic driver, and we can say no to tar oil. If we have the right to know, then we can have the right to choose. So we need the government's help with that. And, you know, one of the ways that we can do this, too, is we can start looking for responsible contracting to happen. Say, you know, take a sweatshop campaign example. You know, we didn't figure out how to make sweatshops overseas illegal, but we did figure out a way to pressure Nike and Reebok and the city of Portland to only buy sweatshop-free materials, or to make that a requirement when they purchase.
Establish that.
Yeah, well, let's do this thing for tar oil. You know, let's say we don't want that stuff, and let's get some big customers out there to say, we don't want to do this anymore. We want you to tell us this came from a place where you didn't clear-cut the forest, inject the ground with solvents, rip it up, and turn it into a lake of ash and soot. And we'd actually like you just to use the best standards practice as possible. We'd prefer that. Thanks very much.
It's similar to the folks that are doing the fur-free campaign.
Absolutely.
You know, stop doing this to animals. You don't need it.
Let's take their customer base away. Let's everybody make some choices.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you know, we've got about 15 minutes left, and there's a dirty oil documentary that you say is going to be coming to town
February 9th.
February 9th.
Yeah, 7 o'clock at the Baghdad. We're really excited. Leslie Iwerks is the director who helped produce this film and who also wrote and shot the film herself. You'll hear her voice, I think, in a couple overlays, although the narration is done by Neve Campbell, Canadian actress who's lent her energy towards this project.
All right.
It's a beautiful new film. It's about 90 minutes long. We're looking forward to hosting it and having folks come over, check it out, and have some Q&A with a fascinating female director from the Los Angeles area who's really passionate about this work and has been doing lots of other good work. I think her latest documentary is now on Industrial Light and Magic, so she's a real film person. It's not one of those handy-cam shots. This looks like this looks like Hollywood movie.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, keep that in mind when you see this, because, like I said, I videotaped this off the screen, so it won't do it justice, but hopefully the content will come across.
Great.
And we'll be back in a few.
Many people have never heard of this tarry reservoir of riches, also known as the Athabasca tar sands. Canada transports over 1 million barrels of tar sands crude daily through pipelines down to Midwest refineries around the Great Lakes, where it is then refined into gasoline for the U.S. gas tanks. Oil companies and governments are making billions of dollars, but few seem to be taking responsibility for the staggering environmental costs of a modern-day black gold rush.
Each and every year, we become more, not less, addicted to oil. a 19th century fossil fuel that is dirty, dwindling, and dangerously expensive.
There is no such thing as dirty oil. People need to understand that when you use a barrel of oil, it doesn't matter where it comes from. If the barrel of oil is Alberta oil, the barrel of oil comes from Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, or Texas, 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions will come from the consumption of that barrel of oil.
One of our problems as a planet is that we still have something of a frontier mentality. And now suddenly the frontiers are gone and the endless supply of resources is no longer endless. We're discovering it's finite. The consumption of energy in the world is driven by two basic trends. One is population growth. The other is rising energy consumption per person. We now have both of them in the world. Each year we're adding about 70 million people a year. If everyone in the world now wanted to consume at the US level, for example, it would take 3 planets the size of the Earth to support. Gasoline consumption in the United States exceeds that of the next 20 countries combined. We have 30% of the world's automobiles. We drive them on average much further than cars are driven in the rest of the world. But unfortunately, what we're now looking at is a world where oil production will soon be declining. And that realization leads us to look at many alternatives to conventional oil. In the last couple of decades, we've seen an effort in Canada to extract oil from tar sands. And this is sort of the oil version of strip mining. The difference between that oil and the oil we've been using for the last century is that it takes a lot of heat to get that oil out. It's an extraordinarily carbon-intensive, climate-disruptive source of energy.
Well, short and sweet. And we've been throwing a lot of the same information at you from different angles and just trying to emphasize that this is an issue that connects up with a lot of other issues. And whether we're talking about liquefied natural gas, or you mentioned South Korea, the Korean free trade, there's the folks, the Oregon Fair Trade Campaign, they were talking about this a while ago, that if we sign that free trade agreement, they're going to be sending over probably, they'll have the low bid, and they'll be sending over some either equipment or workers to join into our green revolution here in Oregon and build some of these wind turbines or the sun, getting energy from the sun. So, we don't want that Korean free trade agreement. That's another thing we need to think about. You brought up a really good point about that they're selling the equipment that's going to be going up to Canada.
Yeah.
And, Obama, you mentioned you want to talk about Obama. He said that he's going to renegotiate NAFTA, and turns around and he's going to go ahead with the Korea free trade agreement, which is an egregious backslide on his campaign promises.
Well, right now, the Obama administration has an enormous opportunity to get involved in this with Ray LaHood at Transportation, with Lisa Jackson at the EPA, and Hillary Clinton in the State Department. All have cards they can play to turn off the spigot for tar oil. And so I would encourage any viewer, listener, watcher, person who sees this or talks about this to your friend or neighbor to contact the administration and to contact those 3 key figures with the administration. Tell them that you're not in favor of encouraging our dependence on the worst, lowest grade, most environmentally destructive oil source you could possibly ask for. Say no to tar oil, and those folks could make a difference. That campaign was sold on a lot of hope. And I think those of us who are activists for any period of time know that hope is an important part of our jobs and an important part of the solution. And I can still, at this point in time, still say I hope Obama does better. But frankly, if he needs to.
Yeah, I'm hoping he'll own up to at least one of the things he said. The only thing he did so far that I can remember is his backing off, keeping the feds backed off from persecuting medical marijuana. but I don't know what else. He might have done some other things as well. But people need to get on board with that particular. Was it Ray LaHood? You said
Ray LaHood is the Secretary of Transportation. Lisa Jackson, head of the EPA, and Hillary Clinton has a piece in this one. As in order for an international pipeline to be negotiated, State Department has to sign off on it. And so we would have direct, requests to all those folks, coming that direction. That would be fantastic. Now, the other thing that I would mention, locally, is supporting the great economies that we're doing great pioneering work here. Sequential biofuels. There's a lot of folks that are, buying locally sourced fuel that's, not taking it away from the, corn plantations that we need to have in other parts of the nation for food product. But they're working with these cellulosic fibers. They've got poplar farms, up in Zeachem and Pacific Ethanol have got poplar farms outside of Boardman, where they're working now, taking it down from I think 30-year cycles to 2-year cycles, where it's a plantation of poplars that they've got, they're irrigating it and they're making it happen. And that is an amazing source now, where they put a little bit of sugars into that, and it turns it into gasoline. And boy, that's the kind of new stuff that we need, and that's employing people, and we're excited about that kind of work.
So you say they're getting gasoline from poplar trees?
They're getting gasoline from poplar trees.
Well, you're just full of information I hadn't heard of before.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing, and the neat thing about that is, they do their distilling, refining right on site, so it serves a local fuel web right there. So instead of having to have the gasoline transported from a long distance, which again, we know about this life cycle analysis, that transportation is an impact in terms of the overall cost of the fuel, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of global warming impact. If you have to transport the fuel a long ways, it's expensive fuel. So they're doing it on site right there for local communities. It's great.
This sounds great, and to me it's the same thing that I had against the liquefied natural gas. We're just in a hole and we keep digging. That's just another way to keep digging, and so was this tar sands thing.
Yeah.
And then heavy haul thing, it's just like an insult on top of injury. And you could probably come up with other things like the mountaintop removal, where they're taking the whole tops of mountains and dropping it into valleys. You're destroying the valleys, you're destroying the mountains. It's just totally moving in the wrong direction.
There is a new book that's coming out. I'll just mention this too. It's called Heart of the Monster, and it's a brand new piece. It's by Rick Bass and David James Duncan, authors who live in the area where this haul is proposed to go through. And they've been interviewing folks, taking some photographs, and they've put together a quick little book for folks to pick up and read, and really just sort of like dig in on what a community activist experience is like on this issue right now. It's not even at Powell's yet. I think the first 4,500 copies of this book are just coming off the press this weekend, and it will be available on the allagainstthehall.org website. I think for the low price of $15 is what it's going for right now.
That's small these days. So All Against the Hall was a really good website. Does the National Wildlife Federation have a website with?
We do. It's got so many backslashes and dots and dashes on it. Like I double checked it really fast, and I knew I wasn't going to remember it. So what I would do is direct folks to our brand new Facebook page, www.facebook.com/TarFreeOregon. Really easy. You can just put TarFree. If you're on Facebook already, just put TarFree Oregon. It'll pop right up. And that page, we are aggregating all kinds of resources there, keeping it active with maybe 1 to 3 posts every day. Pulling together the news so you don't have to go far to do it. And that's another place where you can find out about ticketing against the documentary on February 9th for Dirty Oil or at the Baghdad, and for other local actions that are going to be coming up, maybe around the low carbon fuel standards public hearings that will be happening between January and June. So lots of things that will be happening in the area.
Well, it's important that Oregon jump on board, but there's a little piece of L.A. that has as many people in it as the whole state of Oregon. Is there anybody? Are those folks moving at all in this direction, talking about tar?
I have heard as recently as just this week that people are talking about trying to figure out how to do more things like this. And actually, I stumbled across an Arizona website very similar to our work, where folks were locally concerned about what was going on with the tar sands. And so I'm heartened to know that I feel we're really on the beginning of a brand new conversation about this stuff. People have known for a long time it's us against big oil, and they haven't been empowered to make a choice to make a difference. The gas is oil. Everybody knows, like, okay, I know I'm bad. I'll drive less, or it's what I got to do, right? But now we're actually saying, wait, they're going to make it worse. Wouldn't you like to push back on that? Wouldn't you like to have a voice and say, no, I don't want it to be worse? Wouldn't you like a voice to say, no, I'd rather pick the company that is going to at least not make it worse? And I think it's going to be easy for people to say, yeah, I'd like to be a part of that.
You know, I wish we'd have had this opportunity, whatever it was, 50, 60, 80, 100 years ago, when General Motors was ripping up all the tracks in towns, so people had to drive. And I forget some of the tricks that were pulled back in then. People just, you know, we weren't taught to think critically. We weren't taught to do some of the things you talked about earlier, when, you know, presence of mind and all that. Well, we have that opportunity now, especially with the internet.
Well, when we build out instead of build in, Portland still has a pretty dense core, and you know, folks like 1,000 Friends of Oregon and the Metro Regional Government. I mean, Tom McCall, we fought important, great fights for many, many years about this stuff. But as you can see, you know, when growth keeps going out in Washington County, and keeps gobbling here and there in Clackamas County, and even parts of East Multnomah County, little hobby farms are disappearing, and little pads for mobile parks and little pads for new apartment complexes are going up. So it's one of those things where you have to figure out, we gotta control both ends of the supply, demand. What are we using the oil for? Is it our trip that we're doing, or is it because we're supporting government growth, supporting business growth that's really doing things that's pretty expensive for all of us to keep up with? It's greater if we can make the choices to live local, shop local, do our recreation local, do those smart things as you can.
And all those local things are important, but it's really not all just about us. It's about the country. It's about our water supply. I don't know that aquifer you mentioned that is being drained in order to do what you were saying, but I know
threatened, not being drained. The Oglala aquifer in Nebraska.
That's right. But I know we have drained like the Oglala aquifer. It took millions of years for that to get filled, and they're using it to sluice coal. And when the water disappears in other parts of this country, I know where people are going to go. They're going to come here because this is going to be one of the few places that still have water. And it isn't just Vegas and Arizona and different places like that. There's droughts in Atlanta, Georgia, and places that people are not having water there. Right. And water is a really important thing. And as you were saying, it's like 4 drums of water to equal 1 drum of tar sand oil, something like that. 2 to 4, I think.
They're doing some more recycling of that water up out of the Athabasca River, and I won't say that
got less than a minute here.
I won't get into the quibble on that stuff, but I do know that they are doing more recycling, so that I'm not quite sure if that statistic is up to date at the very current moment. But what we do know is they're making a huge mess. And they're not cleaning it up.
Not cleaning it up. Well, we hope this was interesting to folks. We didn't get any phone calls, but folks were probably busy in the internet, getting ready to make them phone calls. It's an important issue, and it isn't just what they're doing there. It affects what we do here. And so conversely, what we do here will affect what happens up there. And so I encourage people to get on board and research this issue. We gave you some websites, and we'll talk more about this in the future. So thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.